Hello, everybody. My name is Brett Diamond. I'm a fourth grade teacher, and this is my presentation for MAD 545. My presentation is on accommodations for instruction and assessment, and I have a PowerPoint made up, so I'd like to share my screen here. This is my first time recording on Zoom and also posting to YouTube, so hopefully this will work out well. All right, let's start with our objectives for today. I'd like to describe the difference between modifications and accommodations. I'd also like to explain the use of modifications and accommodations in inclusive classroom settings. And then I'd like to explain the difference between a 504 plan and an IEP. This is really important to me because when I chose the topic, I wasn't exactly sure the difference between modifications and accommodations. So I wanted to start out by defining them. So I started with what is an accommodation. And an accommodation can be something very simple to make a student academically or behaviorally successful. I decided to focus on academics because my topic was accommodations for instruction and assessment. What's important to know is that an accommodation doesn't change the expectations or the content standards or the requirements for the task. And I found that what was interesting was that it can be appropriate for any student who has difficulty learning. It doesn't have to be a student who has a disability or has an IEP. Sometimes we do accommodations for students and we don't even realize that they are accommodations. We're just trying to help them or do what's best for a student. However, when we're talking about students with special needs, they do have the legal right to appropriate and necessary accommodations to help them learn. Here are some examples of accommodations. They can be very simple, like a gripper on a pencil. I've used many of these in the classroom, and I found a connection between some of these and the antecedents that we had recently been reading about, such as preferential seating, and it seems like some of these accommodations could also help with classroom management. I separated them into two categories: instructional accommodations and testing accommodations. And this is not an exhaustive list. It's just a few examples, some of which I've used in my classroom and some of which I have not used just yet. Here is an example of one that I just happened to use just the other day. I was working with a girl, and I noticed that she was using her finger to keep track of the type in a book. So I gave her this ruler that has a piece of clear plastic at the very top of the ruler. And if you can see it, this is a poem. And you move the ruler down the page, and the clear piece of plastic shows the reader one line at a time. So if a reader is overwhelmed by all of the type on a page, this could be very helpful. And it's a really easy accommodation for a student. Here is a list of accommodations that I received at the beginning of the school year for a particular student of mine. This student has an IEP and some very special needs. So she does need certain things, like she goes to social group and she has occupational therapy. But this really helped her, and it helped me to start things off and have a successful year with her, because I knew what she needed. She needed a structured environment. She needed prompting. She needed help with organizational skills. She needed a daily behavior chart. And she's also gifted. So it was very, very helpful to get this from one of our special education teachers. Two other examples of what I use to collaborate with special education teachers. But the one on the left is from our guidance counselor, and this helps her plan for the PSSA and what students might need as far as the PSSA goes for small groups. She needs to know what accommodations we give students, whether that accommodation is listed in the student's IEP or if it's just something that we do for them. Accommodations, we're just trying to level the playing field, so to say, and we're not trying to give students an unfair advantage, but just give them a way to access the material. That was one thing I read in my research about concerns over whether we were giving students unfair advantages, and that can be shown when you give a student the student without disabilities the same accommodations that you give a student with disabilities, then their score should still be the same. On the right, you see a learning support room checklist, and this is something that I can fill out weekly about whether the student's having any difficulties. If there are any tests coming up, then the learning support teacher can help them prepare for the test, and the student can have the accommodation of taking the test in the learning support classroom. And that teacher can also find out if the student is struggling with any material. So as you can see with these documents, it's very important to make sure that you're collaborating with other teachers and professionals in your building. I mentioned the two special education teachers, but also the guidance counselor as well. That brings me to what is a modification. And a modification is also an adaptation, but this is for a student where an accommodation just isn't enough. So you have to actually change the content standard, change that expectation, or change the requirement. And that might be where you provide multiple ways to access and respond to content. So you still want there to be some of the same content, but you have to think about different ways that student can access that content and also respond to it, because you still want there to be academic learning there, but it may have to be on a different level. Some examples of modifications. One that I've used in the past has been less answers on a multiple choice test, perhaps only having 2 choices instead of 4 for a student who becomes overwhelmed by having those 4 choices and isn't able to narrow them down. A student having fewer weekly spelling words. I have a student right now who really struggles with his spelling and is not quite on the 4th grade reading level, so he has fewer spelling words every week. And that goes along with having lower level reading assignments or taking alternate assignments. He would just really struggle. And with that struggle, I see some misbehavior. I see his mind wandering, and I see him off task. But if I give him material, if I modify the content and I give him material that's on his level, then I see that he's able to access the material and have success. So I still have high expectations for him, and I'm still pushing him along, but I'm meeting him at his level and where it's appropriate for him. One of the research articles I was reading by Lee from 2010 was mentioned that students are more engaged in the material if it has been modified for them, if it's a necessary modification, and that leads to more on-task behavior. And that's better for teachers too, because they have to spend less time on classroom management as well. So it's a benefit for all parties. Next up, I'd like to talk a little bit about a 504 plan. And this involved me reading a little bit and doing some research on some of the legal aspects of education and IDEA. And the 504, it refers to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act Amendments of 1973 and Americans with Disability Act, ADA. This is for students that have a disability that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And it's for students who do not qualify under IDEA and do not have an IEP. These major life activities, they could be concentrating, reading, thinking, hearing, breathing, eating. And I really only have, in my 9 years of teaching, I really only have experience with one student who's had a 504 plan. And that was a student that had a hearing disability. What I had for him, I had a microphone that I wore on a string around my neck. And I spoke with my regular voice, and it was just amplified, and the student could hear my voice through the microphone. But I had someone from the BCIU that came out maybe once a month or once every couple months, and she would check in with me and check in with the student to make sure that he could hear everything that I was saying. That's my only experience with the 504 plan. Perhaps in the future I'll have more experience, and this is the reason. It seems in the past that only about 1% of students were getting a 504 plan due to some very restrictive guidelines. However, in 2009, the ADA had an Amendments Act, and that really expanded who could be covered under these 504 plans. So they didn't want to discriminate against some other health impairments, and it really expanded on who could be covered by a 504 plan. Next up, I wanted to talk briefly about IEPs and how that may be different from a 504 plan. An IEP is certainly more detailed, and it's a written plan for serving students with disabilities ages 3 through 21. And it is a plan that has to be followed by law, just like a 504 plan. So there are some similarities, but this from my experience has been, much more detailed, much more very, very strict, that you have to follow it by law, of course, but it involves a team providing support and services for instruction and testing. And the teacher has to be very careful and knowledgeable about what is in the IEP. And it's very important at the beginning of the year, prior to the school year, to meet with the special education teachers to know what you have to do. And the teacher is certainly a very valuable member of that IEP team, because they have the real firsthand knowledge of the student. As a student gets older, I think it's important possibly for the student to be involved in their own IEP or in their own selection process when it comes to accommodations, and to be an advocate for their own special education services. I'm a 4th grade teacher, so I don't really see that at my age level, but I also think it's important during the IEP process to have students try to be a part of the general education classroom as much as possible, because I see, and I read in the research, that even students with significant cognitive disabilities, they're able to pick up as much of the regular ed content as possible, and it also can benefit them socially as well. Here are a few of the sources that I used for my presentation, and I hope I cleared that up for you, the differences between accommodations and modifications. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it, and have a nice day.